Welcome, everyone. I'm Angelo Robles, to Angelo Robles' Effective Family Office podcast, where I look to distill the best practices and best ideas of the world's most successful families and their family offices. I hope to provide thought-provoking opinions and feature amazing thought leaders to our listeners of the podcast with an eye towards the future of the family office. Today's podcast is titled Stress Testing for Vulnerabilities in Your Estate and Business Continuation During COVID-19. It features Kevin Ellman, CFP and CEO, and Paul Miller of Wealth Preservation Solutions. To give you some context to the session today, most families develop their wealth plan over a period of years working with a variety of different professional advisors. Often there are many changes that take place as the planning process unfolds. Families grow, businesses evolve, advisors change, and laws change. Sometimes these changes are incorporated into the plan, and I'm going to be honest with you, oftentimes they're not. In some cases, the advisors work well coordinated, and you know what I'm going to say next? In most cases, no. And I've seen this from families from 10 to 20 million of net worth to billionaires. It really doesn't matter. Many of them, we all make the same mistake. And why is that? Well, many of us look at the opportunity of building our enterprise and business, and we're so focused on that. And we look at that as being engaging. We look at investing perhaps as being a little bit more engaging. But when we're talking about things with coordinating it all, business continuation, estate planning, tax planning, that's a little more uncomfortable. Some people like to kick that down the road. They know it's important. It's just something about human nature that causes that to happen. So the opportunity of having a well-coordinated plan, and we've been talking about stress testing for years, and we especially picked it up when I co-authored a book with Russ Allen Prince, Peter Sasaki, who's on the call today, and John Bowen, that is very impactful and includes in the subtitle, stress testing. So it's really important to understand all the things that I just said. Is your plan up to date, given your current family scenario, your financial scenario, what's going on in the world, and there's lots going on, and tax laws and various changes. Now, yeah, this may be a little more centric to U.S. families, but this is going to be applicable whether you have U.S. holdings and interest, which many international families do. And some of the same concepts and principles are kind of going to apply wherever you are. We highly encourage, and it's one of the services from a different perspective on family office structures that we do at my core company, Family Office Association, especially now in the remote and digital era that we're in. Everything is adapting and changing. And when it comes to something like an estate plan, how do you know as a successful entrepreneur if it's really good or not? With investing, you kind of see the results unfold in front of you. But that's not the case with a lot of other planning. So you need to have a second and often a third set of eyes, even if it's not the lead one, to kind of keep an eye on interpreting the impact and the hopeful results to you, and just to make sure, because it's so nuanced and so regulatory and so many changes, this is a complex issue. And I've known Paul and Kevin for not too long, but for probably 8 or 9 months now, and they were introduced to me by an iconic firm, KPMG, and I've been nothing but impressed by their diligence and the work that they do, and we're really excited to have them today. So we're going to do this in a little different format than we normally do. For the most part, it's going to be more of a clean flow presentation format by Paul and Kevin. I'll incorporate perhaps a couple of questions here or there. We do have a live audience as well that could send questions through the chat feature that we may be able and likely could weave into the dialogue. But it's good to mix things up. You know, we do the interview format so much to once in a while do a presentation format or another format or have a special guest like we did with Ryan Anson that led our cannabis discussion a couple of weeks ago. It adds a different voice and perspective. Kevin and Paul, welcome to the show. How are you?
Good. Well, thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Really, really exciting. Thank you. Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Paul. Well, I gave you guys quite the build-up there because I think this is really an intriguing subject, stress testing for vulnerabilities in your estate tax and business continuation plan, especially during COVID-19. As I noted, Kevin, I'm going to pretty much hand over the reins to you, and I'll weave in a little bit with some questions and engage the audience, but why don't you take it from here and weave what you built, which is very impressive, you and Paul, for our audience to understand.
Sure. Well, everything you said is 100% true. Paul and I have been working with family offices and family businesses for well over 20 years. And everything you've described, we've seen many, many times. And I think the number one thing that you pointed out is that most people are doing their planning over a period of years. Very few people sit down on one day and say, okay, this is it. I'm going to complete my wealth planning in the next 60 days and it's done. Most people, they'll do a will, then 5 or 10 years later, they might set up a trust. They may add insurance to it. They may expand their business. They may have a new partner. They may start new businesses. So the one thing we know is that the financial life and wealth life of families will change and evolve. So, and as you pointed out, very, very few people go back and make sure, oh, gee, have I coordinated all the things that I've done over the past 10 years to make sure that they work well together? So the way I like to say it is, what would happen if you had to use your plan today? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you died today. It could mean that you decided to sell a business or that you and your partner decided to go separate ways. It doesn't necessarily mean death, which is not the most popular topic on the planet. But if you had to use your plan today, exactly what would happen and to whom would it happen? So the only way to know that is to do a stress test. So the stress test is going to say, okay, let's pretend we have to put your will into effect today. Let's pretend that your insurance paid off today, that your trusts were actuated, that all of your assets passed via the current asset titling, that your business buy-sell agreement was triggered today. What would actually happen? And when we do that, we often find out that what was thought to be the original plan doesn't actually happen at all. So I want to give you a couple of stories to illustrate this point, rather than give you a bunch of numbers and laws. I think actual case studies of people who lived before and we understand what their problems were will really help to illustrate the points we're trying to make. So I'm going to ask Paul if you could share with us a story of a famous family that would illustrate, what happens if you really don't take advantage of all the wealth transfer planning and make sure that you've done this all in advance.
So as Kevin brings up, most of our clients have built their wealth through businesses, closely held businesses. And at the end of the day, it constitutes the greatest amount of their wealth. And Angela, let me ask you, do you remember who owned the Dolphins and where they played in the late 70s and early 80s?
Well, you happen to be asking the right person, being a football fan, and old enough, I might add, Paul, to remember that. That would be the Joe Robbie family.
Correct. So the Joe Robbie family owned the Miami Dolphins, and they played in Joe Robbie Stadium. And he and his wife both died within a year of each other in the early 90s. They had 7 children, and their plan was for 3 of their children to continue the business. Well, upon their second death, the estate tax was due, and the estate tax on the estate was approximately $47 million. The bulk of their wealth was held in the team and the stadium. So they sold in 1994. The family had to sell the team and the stadium to Wayne Huizenga. And a little aside, only person ever to start 3 Fortune 500 companies from scratch.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yes, started 3 from scratch. Pretty incredible.
Amazing.
He bought the team in 1994 for about $110 million. Family paid $47 million worth of taxes, and they split they split the rest of the proceeds. In 2009, he sold the teams, Wayne Hosanga, to Stephen Ross. Do you know what the sale price was?
I'm going to take a guess. It was a hell of a lot more than the number you mentioned that he purchased it for. I'm going to say 1.3, 1.4 billion.
Very close, $1.1 billion.
Oh, not bad.
Not bad. So 15 years later. So the question always is, did the family lose the $47 million of estate tax payment because they hadn't done the proper wealth transfer planning? Or did they actually lose the difference between the $50,000 they netted, $50 million they netted versus the $1.1 billion that the team sold for 15 years later? And there's a very good chance they would have kept it in the family. And as you know, most football franchises today are worth in excess of $2 billion.
Wow.
If I may, Paul, that was an excellent story, that last point specifically, to bring home to the audience. Now, yeah, maybe many that are listening in live or will see this on video or listen to it as a podcast that are very wealthy families may not be owning a professional sports team. But do you have a family that owns assets that are maybe privates or real estate that are relatively illiquid, and now they're forced to sell them? Now, let me emphasize that. Sell them during the times we're going through now, COVID-19, specifically real estate. They're going to take a 30 to 40% hit on that versus an asset that, if it could stay within the family for a generation or even 10 or 20 years, a little bit like the Joe Robbie with the Miami Dolphins, would be worth much, much more. That's a great point. Very good job, Paul.
Thank you, Joe.
So you also said something else. You said the word well coordinated. And Paul and I have determined that this is the number one problem that families run into. Most of them are dealing with very, very competent professionals. They may have a great legal team, a great accounting team. They may have an insurance group, an investment group, but rarely do they have all these people talking to each other. So what we have discovered is that the biggest problems result from, I'll say, things falling between the cracks where not everything is properly coordinated. So, you know, it's easy to say that, but I wanted to give you an example. And maybe, Paul, you could share with us a story that shows what happens when the wills and the titling and everything else is not properly coordinated.
So, you know, we have a very common issue where couples have been married 50 years, have to raise families together. One of the spouses dies, and the remaining spouse gets remarried. And in most of those cases, what do they typically do to protect the wealth for the families, Angelo?
What do they do in that scenario?
They'll sign a prenuptial agreement.
Yes.
So,
that would be a common request.
Common request, prenuptial agreement. So the prenuptial agreement is signed, but then we find out that at a triggering event, we'll call it death, the prenuptial agreement, we have a situation here where we had a family that we've done the planning for all the children, because this is what happened when the father died. The mother died, the father had all the assets. It was an estate worth about $30 million. He signed a prenuptial that would leave his new wife $1 million and the house if he were to predecease her, and the balance of the assets would go to the children. He passed away, and at the end of the day, the entire estate passed to the second wife. They were married less than 2 years. So
how can that be? What happened?
Yeah, the question is, how could that happen if they had a prenuptial agreement? So what they had done is, after he got remarried, they had moved into a new house. They bought a new house, and they retitled it joint tenants with rights of survivorship. And they moved all the money from his accounts into a joint account with a new investment advisor. And again, the accounts were titled joint tenants with rights of survivorship. So the assets in the investment accounts and the assets in the house passed by titling to the new spouse. They bypassed the will. The only assets, without getting technical, that would have flown through the will were the assets that were in his individual name. Since there were no individual assets, it was the prenuptial agreement and the will were basically meaningless. So,
wow, that's not the effect that person wanted.
And Angela, I can't tell you how often when we do a stress test with families in second marriages, they have prenuptial agreements, they have wills, they have it all spelled out, but because of the titling, it flows as we just described in this case. So it's very important, as Kevin said, not only do you have to have the proper documents, you have to make sure all the titling is coordinated with the documents.
Well, Paul, so far you're batting 1,000. You gave us some great tips on really two different things that even I didn't off the top of my head think about, with the selling of assets, given the Joe Robbie example and what you miss out on growth, and the titling of assets and resources. There's families worth tens of billions of dollars that don't get that right, or they got it right 2, 5, 10, 12 years ago.
Exactly.
Just things change and they're just not updated. It fell through the cracks.
You know, we're going to talk about business succession, and we have a number of points we're going to bring up, but I'll also bring that up as well. We have many family businesses with there were 2 brothers, 3 brothers in the business, or sisters, family members in the business, and they have a buy-sell agreement that they will be bought out by their siblings if something were to happen. And many times they formed the company when the kids were younger, and then they don't look at that. As Kevin said, they do what you said before, they do the planning, they put it on the shelf, and they don't look at it again. And all of a sudden, fast forward 10, 15 years later, some of the individuals have kids in the business. And we've had these cases where the kids are in the business, they redo their wills that say, we want my share of the business to flow to my daughter who's in the business. But they have a buy-sell agreement that says they get bought out by their siblings. If that were the case, what would you think would take precedent, the buy-sell agreement or the will document?
The will?
So the actual answer is the buy-sell agreement. So the way it works is titling and then contract or beneficiary before the will. So if you have a beneficiary designation or a contract, the buy-sell is a contract. The contract says that the estate is contractually committed to selling the assets to, in this case, we'll say the 2 brothers, instead of going through the will to the daughter who was in the business. So once again, instead of the daughter being in the business, the estate would get bought out of the business. And it's a very, very common issue where people who've had family businesses for a long time, when situations change, they don't update the shareholders agreement. Exactly. So that's a very, and the fact that you brought that up, most people agree with you. They think the will takes precedent. The will is actually the weakest document in the whole estate plan. After first titling, second contract, and beneficiary designations before we get to the will.
Good points.
So you mentioned something, you said the word change. So we know that families change and businesses change, and most people have this notion that the laws are the same and they stay the same pretty much forever. And what's interesting is that the estate tax law has actually changed dramatically over the past 10 and 15 years. And actually there's some changes that are coming up that, barring some gigantic political change, are going to happen. So this is a constantly shifting landscape. And we want to talk about, this applies today because we're about to face some changes that will take away some advantages that we have today. And Paul has some ideas about how we should use those advantages today and avoid losing them. So perhaps you can address that, Paul?
Essentially, you remember do you remember what the lifetime exemption, what a family could pass to their children tax-free was in the 90s when Clinton was president?
It was 300,000?
It was actually 600,000 was the lifetime exemption. And Clinton passed a bill. It was incredible. It was going to increase to $1 million by the time, by 2000. When George Bush became president, they passed a new law that continually increased the exemption. And actually, there was 1 year with no estate tax in 2010. So that was the 1 year. That's the year that George Steinbrenner died.
That's right.
Right. So, the estimates are any place from $350 to $600 million in taxes that his family saved as a result of him passing away that year.
Well, since I'm a Yankee fan, that's good. It's more money into players.
Correct.
If they play this year.
That's a big question mark.
Yes.
So what Kevin alluded to is, so over time, the exemption had been raised to $5.5 million. And as of 2016, it was about 5.5 index for inflation. When President Trump passed his tax bill in 2017, the lifetime exemption doubled. So each individual has a lifetime exemption of approximately $11.5 million. So a husband and wife can pass $23 million to their kids tax-free. On December 31st, 2025, the sun sets on that law, and we revert back to that $5 million exemption index for inflation. So basically, we have an opportunity between now and 2025 to give away that delta that will go away. And they passed laws that allow for that to be done with no callback. So you have an opportunity, as Kevin was alluding to do some really good planning in the next 4 to 5 years. And as he said, what could change that? If the Democrats take both sides of the House and the presidency, there's always a chance it won't last to 2025. If we have split government, what I can pretty much assure you is that it will expire on December 31st, 2025. So again, if people have done their planning prior to this time frame, it's a good time to take a look at it to see if they can take advantage of that opportunity.
But notwithstanding, whenever you've done your planning, we know that the legal landscape will change. So, we advise people every few years, maybe not every single year, but certainly every 3 years at the latest, to review the plan and make sure that it still makes sense today and makes sense for the laws that are coming down the pike. So let's shift gears for a second and talk about businesses. So I would say in our experience, the vast majority of the families you work with have developed their wealth as a result of a family business. So oftentimes families are reluctant, the founders are reluctant to give up control of the business, and maybe they're worried that they don't have enough money. So, sometimes people are reluctant to put a plan into place. So we had an experience a few years back which really, really illustrates this point graphically. And perhaps, Paul, you'll share that with us.
Yeah, so Kevin was a regular on CNBC. And after one talk about business succession, we were contacted by an individual who came in and he told us he was 62 years old and he'd been in the business for 41 years. He wanted to sell the business and retire. So after we got a few facts, there was only one problem we had. He was only a 10% owner. So we asked him who owned the other 90%. And he told us, and we asked him if he would bring in the other shareholder for our next meeting. So a week later, he brought in his 101-year-old father into our office. And the business was probably at that time worth about $50 million. And the estate tax laws, as onerous as they are today, were more onerous back then. And we asked him why he had not taken advantage of planning opportunities over the years to transfer more of the business to his son. What do you think he said, Angelo?
He wanted to have final say. He wanted control.
Well, two things. It was interesting. He said, this guy had some unbelievable, the 62-year-old probably was going to live forever because his mother had died the previous year at 99. So the 101-year-old father moved in with the son, and he's told us that he was always ready to go to work at 7:30, and the son never left till 8. So he questioned his work ethic. And then the second part was, he said, I'm really not sure he's ready.
And how long had the son been working in the business?
Think about this. He started to work right out of college, so he'd been there for 41 years.
Wow.
And he's not ready. And the father, when you added the business in, the father's estate, and most of it was comprised of business, probably $100 million. Today, the tax on that, because he lived in the New York area, is about $40 million. You can imagine what it was 15 years ago. So because he hadn't done the proper planning, there was no choice. That business was absolutely going to be sold at the end of the day. Yeah. And it's a very common problem. We find the patriarch has a hard time very often passing on the control.
Yes, that's something we all see.
Yeah. So we're not going to delve into that today, but we have a couple of creative solutions that can solve that problem, where the patriarch can retain control and yet begin the estate planning process without giving up control. So that's one of the things that we've learned how to solve that problem.
As a matter of fact, I think in July we're going to be doing a joint presentation with KPMG, and we're going to be talking about some of those ideas.
So that story was an example of what we call business succession, passing the business from one generation to the next. But we also have situations where you've got, as Paul alluded to before, we got siblings in the business or parents and children. And even if you have a buy-sell agreement, most people think So even if I say to you, Angelo, what would you say most people want a buy-sell agreement to deal with? What issue?
Well, they want the assets in the business to go to the party they wanted to, but they're probably concerned that that other party is not going to have the resources to be able to buy it out of their estate.
Well, so you said two things there which were correct. So one is they may not have the resources, and the other is the estate. So most buy-sell agreements deal with the issue of what happens if somebody dies. And we're going to go into it a little bit more. And typically there's insurance involved to help, help do exactly what you said, pay off make the purchase price. But not everybody dies. So what happens if you have a situation where there's just a simple disagreement, or somebody gets divorced, or somebody retires, somebody just decides, I want to go in a different direction, I want to be in a different business. So the buy-sell agreement really should address all those different issues, not just death. But the vast majority just deal with what happens if somebody passes away. So we've got two good examples of what happens if the buy-sell agreement doesn't address all those different issues. So Paul, can you give us a story there?
Kevin. As Kevin said, a buy-sell should address all the issues: death, disability, somebody quits, somebody gets fired. And most of the time, the one thing that most people are concerned about is death. And we found in our careers that the one triggering event that is pretty definitive is death.
And most people know when their partner is dead.
The others are not so clear. And historically, if you look at what triggers a buy-sell agreement, death is probably the smallest percentage of the triggering events. And we had one example. We got called up. We had a car dealership in New Jersey called us. At this point, it's probably 15 years ago. Called us and said they'd been referred to us, and they had an issue that he said his son had quit, and 2 weeks later he had called and wanted to get paid, and so we set up a meeting, and I said, can you bring us your buy-sell agreement? So he sent it to me beforehand to look at it. And most buy-sell agreements are properly drafted are any place from 20 to 30 pages and cover all the contingencies. This was a one-page agreement that said if anybody died, this was the number they would get, and then it was signed, and it was about 10 years old. So when we got into it, what happened is the father and the son had a disagreement. The son left the dealership. The father said that he quit. The son said he was fired. The son wanted to be bought out. He had been gifted by the father about 10 years before that, 25% of the business, and he wanted his share, which he thought was $2.5 million. The father said, there's no way the dealership is worth anything more than $4 million. I'll give him $1 million. So they went into litigation. 2.5 years later, after the father and his daughter, who was still in the business, paid $500,000 worth of legal fees, they ended up paying the full price to the son at 2.5. So as Kevin was saying, we have to make sure that every buy-sell agreement covers all the contingencies, and it's pretty ironclad.
Yes, and like you said, I think of them as being more in the event of death, and they are. That certainly is one important reason, but there's many other factors where it could be triggered. I don't think that gets the attention it deserves, but that's why we're talking about it now.
Exactly. So let's assume for the moment that you have decided to have a buy-sell agreement. You want to have all the different issues covered, and you go to your lawyer and you say, okay, let's have a buy-sell agreement. Well, it turns out that, again, it's not as simple as that, because there's two major kinds of buy-sell agreements. One is called a stock redemption, and that means that if something happens, the company is going to buy out your shares. So let's say there's two partners in the company. One partner passes away. The company is going to buy out the shares of the deceased partner or the disabled partner, and then by virtue of being the last person standing, the other partner owns 100% of the business. And that works. And the other kind is called a cross-purchase agreement, and this is between two people. So let's say, Angelo, you and I are partners, and let's say I get hit by a bus, and now I'm not here. You would buy my family out, and you would end up owning all the shares. So there's some significant differences between those two types of agreements, which most people have no idea what the implications are. So maybe, Paul, you could take us through some of those differences.
So, just talking about what Kevin discusses, if a company, as you talked about, Angelo, before, most companies insure the buy-sell agreements. So
Yes.
if you and Kevin were partners, and let's say the company was worth $80 million, and in a perfect world, Kevin died, there would be a $40 million life insurance.
Wait. Why is that a perfect world?
It's Angelo's perfect world if you were partners.
Okay, fine.
I think that's his preference if you're partners who dies first. So
that's the problem in these seminars. Somebody always has to die. But unfortunately, it's usually me. I don't like that.
We'll have to reverse those roles next time, Kevin. It's
All
going to
right.
be Paul's turn.
All right, keep track of that,
Kevin,
Angelo.
when we usually do this, Angelo, it's Kevin and I always talk about if we're partners, and I say if Kevin dies, and one client asks me why Kevin died, and I said, well, out of the two of us, I prefer it that way.
At least you're honest.
Yeah.
So imagine you receive, so the $40 million comes into the company. What's the nice thing, when that life insurance is received by the company, what is one of the aspects of life insurance? Is there any tax due on that money?
No.
No tax due. And when you give that money to Kevin's wife, the company gives that money to Kevin's wife and they give it back to stock, does his wife have any tax due?
I don't know.
Actually, no, because when Kevin died, imagine you started that company with $100,000, $100,000 each. So he has a $100,000 basis, and the company's giving him 40.
Oh, the step up.
But his wife received a step up in basis,
Yeah.
the estate. So there's no tax. So you receive the $40 million tax-free. His wife receives the $40 million tax-free, no tax. It's beautiful. A cross-purchase agreement is set up a little differently. Instead of the company redeeming the stock, you personally would redeem the stock. So instead of the company receiving the $40 million, you would receive the $40 million. So you get the $40 million. Any tax when you receive it?
No.
No. You give it to Kevin's wife. She gets the $40 million. Any tax when she receives it?
If I factor in the step up, I would assume not.
No. So
Right.
basically, in both cases, the $40 million is received in insurance. It's given to the wife. No tax on either end. So most people say, well, what's the difference between the two? So imagine now you own the company now, and all of a sudden you realize that Kevin actually did a lot more work than appeared when you were working with him. So I always thought, basically I always thought it was the CNN and family office appearances, but he actually does a lot more than that. So all of a sudden you realize Kevin really did some work. You don't want to run this by yourself anymore. And you sell the company and it sells for $80 million. If the company had redeemed the stock, what's your basis?
The 40 million?
Your original basis.
Yeah. Oh, the original. Yeah.
You have your original $100,000 basis. You're going to pay full capital gains tax on the $80 million.
But not as such for the other party that got the step up.
Correct. So if you did the cross purchase, you personally received that $40 million. You gave it to his wife. So you now have $40 million worth of basis. So you have $8 million less in taxes when you sell that stock. So just by the structure of the agreement, and there was no change, except that you had the insurance paying to you, to the company. You bought the stock out versus the company. And when you sell the company, you'll have to pay $8 million less in capital gains taxes. And that's only on the federal level. Does not include the potential state taxes.
So there's a tremendous tax advantage to using the cross-purchase agreement. And it may not be perfect in every instance, but certainly people should be aware that there's two different types of agreements, and there's a tremendous advantage to the cross-purchase that should be investigated, before you finalize. So now here's an interesting situation. This is an actual situation we had where the client went to their lawyer and they had multiple partners, and the lawyer said, oh, well, we're going to do a stock redemption agreement. So the agreement says if somebody dies, the company is going to buy them out. Okay? But they went to their insurance agent, and their insurance agent went to a seminar just like this, and they heard, oh, cross-purchase is better. So I'm going to set up the insurance as a cross-purchase. So, okay, so now you got this mismatch. So Paul, what would happen in a situation like that?
This is really what happened. So it was a car dealership, Mercedes dealership. We had a 20% partner and 80% partner. We hadn't done the planning for them. We came in after the fact. And the minority partner owned a $16 million life insurance policy on the majority partner. But the agreement was a stock redemption. It called for the company to buy out the stock over a 10-year period. So when the senior partner died, the junior partner received the $60 million. Was he contractually committed under the agreement to pay that out? No. He was contractually committed under the agreement for the company to pay out over a 10-year period. And the wife did not want to be paid out over a 10-year period. So they actually came up to a deal where he bought her out for 60 cents on the dollar.
Yeah.
So this goes right back to what you said right at the beginning about the coordination piece, Angelo.
Mm-hmm.
Again, attorney drafted a perfectly good buy-sell. Insurance agent put in perfectly good insurance, but the two weren't coordinated.
Exactly.
And so it more often than not, it's really the coordination factor that we find when we do these stress tests. I mean, they have great documents, they have good insurance, but it's not coordinated and it doesn't work the way they intended it to work.
Right. So one of the great values of having a buy-sell agreement is it sets a price. Because let's say, Angela, you and I have a business and we just decide, you know, let's go in a different direction, and I want to buy you out, or you want to buy me out. How do we set the price? We have to have a negotiation. So one of the major purposes of a buy-sell agreement is to set the price. If something happens, this person is going to buy out this person, and this is the price. So typically, they set up what's called a certificate of value. So they sit down and they write, okay, today we signed the agreement, and today the business is worth $80 million. So what happens, Paul, if that business grows and this goes on for another 20 years? What potentially could go wrong?
Angela, so within the association, I'm assuming there are many closely held family businesses?
Yes.
Okay. And most of them are sophisticated. I would pretty much bet that almost all of them, if they do have multiple partners, have a buy-sell agreement. And most of them have established a value, because what's the biggest issue when there's a triggering event and you're trying to settle? What's usually the biggest issue that they're arguing?
Valuation.
Valuation. So we try to structure it such that there's a valuation up front and that they revalue it either every 12 or 24 months. So that's important. Yeah, so when there is a triggering event, there's no issue. And then if there is and then we try to put in a very hard formula when we took the original valuation, that if there isn't a value set, if it hasn't been updated, this formula comes into play. But if you were to view most shareholders agreements, what it says is we go by the certificate of value. If it has not been updated in 12 to 24 months, then it will be based on fair market value.
What's fair?
What is fair? Exactly. So I say if you have to, at the end at a triggering event, determine what fair market value is, it's as if you didn't have an agreement at all. And so it's really critical that when you do that certificate of value, you update it constantly, and that you have a formula that will come up with a number so that there's no fighting between the partners. And let me ask you a question. What most of your members, if you said, let's see your buy-sell agreement, when do you think the last time they updated that certificate of value was?
Not within the last 12 months.
I'll tell you, probably for 90% of them, it was the day they signed the agreement.
Yeah.
Because many times too, and this is what happens, most of the driving force behind the agreements are the people in the insurance industry. Because they get the agreement in place and they want to get the insurance funded. And they do a very good job. They headman the process, the agreement gets in place, the insurance gets funded, and then they're on to the next client. So there's no one there following up to make sure that gets done. So it's really critical that be done every 12 to 24 months. Otherwise, it's as if you didn't sign an agreement.
Exactly.
So you mentioned insurance, and insurance is definitely part of almost all buy-sell agreements. But insurance has other purposes. It's part of a lot of estate plans. And people think, oh, I bought my insurance and I'm done. I paid for it. I have a beneficiary. Maybe I put it in a trust. Maybe I didn't. But most people don't ever think about it ever again for years. So give us an example of what happens when insurance has been neglected and hasn't been properly reviewed. So
Angel, let me ask you from your viewpoint. On insurance, you get the bill, you pay the premium. Would you expect that's what the insurance is in place, every year you get the premium, you pay the premium, you should be set when you die, your family, or whomever the beneficiary should receive the money. Is that a fair statement?
We would assume that would be the assumption, yes.
That's the assumption, and that's what most people do. They put their insurance in place and they leave. So without going into a whole seminar of insurance, but when we were in West Palm Beach, you had an individual talk about insurance, and insurance is a pretty complex financial product. There are some products that have a guaranteed premium and a guaranteed death benefit, but most are based on interest rates or the stock market. And we had a case where one of the top estate planning attorneys who we did a lot of work with in the New York City area called us up one day. He was 81 years old. And he said, Paul, this is crazy. I just got a bill from John Hancock for $144,000. And I said, well, why is that crazy? And he said, well, I've been paying $12,000 a year for the last 30 years. And all of a sudden I got a bill for $144,000. So we contacted John Hancock, and he had a variable universal life product, which was based on stock market returns. He had bought it. When it had been illustrated, they had illustrated a compounded rate of return of 12% per year.
Very generous.
Very generous, which is the least most you can do legally. Needless to say, in that 30-year period, it did not perform at a compounded rate of 12%. So the 144 was the pure insurance cost for that year at 81. The next year it was going to go up to 180. And as long as he lived, if he wanted to keep it in force, he was basically going to be paying annual or renewable term costs. So it's really important that people regularly review their life insurance to make sure that the premiums won't change or won't lapse. Because the last thing you want to do is have paid these premiums for all these years, and then when you most need it, it's not enforced. And it's a very common problem. People aren't even aware of it yet. And when one day that's going to happen. So we recommend that everybody have all their life insurance reviewed, get in-force illustrations. The other issues, are we in a high or low interest rate environment?
Very low.
Very low. So if you take the products that were based on interest rates, the products that were issued in the late 90s, early 2000s were based on 8 to 10% interest rates. The current interest rates are in the 3.5 to 4% rate for these insurance policies. You can imagine very similar scenarios going to happen. People are going to suddenly get into the early 80s and they're going to be getting lapse notices.
That's not good.
No. So Angela, you said before correctly that most times life insurance is received income tax free. And today with the exemption the way it is, you know, most families are not confronting income taxes and estate taxes. That group is becoming smaller and smaller. But for many of your members, if they have large life insurance policies, it's possible that they could be taxable. So Paul, could you explain to us how that works and how do you protect yourself?
So the nice thing about life insurance, if you structure it properly, it should be both income and estate tax free. And to be estate tax free, if you structure a trust correctly and fund it correctly, when those assets pass to your beneficiaries, it will be outside of your estate for estate tax purposes. But if you have a policy that you own personally and you make your children or your wife, let's just say it's your spouse and you die, when your spouse receives those proceeds, and let's just assume it's a $20 million policy, your wife receives those proceeds. Under the current law, she would get it income tax free and estate tax free because being your spouse, it's the unlimited marital deduction. But imagine she takes that $20 million and she puts it into an account. She passes away, a year later. Those assets are in her estate, and that same $20 million is now going to be subject to a 40 to 50% estate tax, depending upon where you live. So because of that, because it was personally owned and went to the spouse, we're going to inadvertently have a $10 million tax the following year.
Unless, Paul, she marries a much younger man in that time frame.
Exactly right. Kevin and I used to qualify for that, but we're told we don't qualify for that anymore.
Yeah, those days are over. All right, so let's shift gears and talk about investments. So at a time like this, since during March, the market collapsed, and depending on which part of the market you looked at, might have gone down 30, 35, 40%. And today, as we sit here, many parts of the market have almost recovered back to even, maybe down 5%, maybe a little bit more. So, and if you looked at the picture, it looks like a pretty deep V. But during a time like this, it's very, very tempting to try to time the market. You know, everybody feels like, gee, if there was only a way that I could sell when the market was about to go down, I'll wait for it to go down, and then when it hits the bottom, then I'll buy at the bottom and I'll get back in. And it sounds great when you say it, but people have a very, very hard time to actually do it. So, you know, I have an example here. We have a client that we went through this back in the last crisis in 2009, and he was a car dealer also, and he called us up, I think it was March 9th, 2009, which was the exact bottom of the market at that point, and said, you know, I think the market is going to get a lot worse, and I want to sell. I'm going to sell everything. So he didn't sell at the top, he sold at the bottom. So then he figured, okay, well, maybe he'll get back in. Well, I would call him periodically. No, I'm not ready to get back in. I think the market's going to, you know, we're going to go into a depression. It's going to get worse. So he kept saying that for another 10 years. And finally, in November of 2019, when the market was at 28,000, almost an all-time high, then now he says, oh, the market's good, solid territory. Now I'm going to buy back in. And of course, no sooner did he buy back in than the market collapsed again in March and went back down. And when it went back down again, now he wants to sell. So this is not true of everybody, but a lot of people, you know, everybody knows you should buy low, sell high. The problem is it is very hard to buy when the market is down. It's scary as heck. And it's very hard to pull the trigger. So we feel that you should avoid, like the plague, trying to time the market, and instead should have time in the market. So those people who, instead of selling in 2009, just held on, they were able to capture 100% of the market recovery and did quite well during that 10-year period. And even people today who held on when the market collapsed 40% and now it came back, they're almost close to even, and they avoided all those problems. So I have an image that I like to use. Think about an escalator, okay? So you're walking up the escalator and you're playing with a yo-yo. So the yo-yo is going up and down, and the yo-yo is the market. So yeah, the market's going up and down all the time, but you're going up the escalator, so there's this constant underlying upward trend. And if you saw, I'm sure you've all seen these charts of the market over the last 100 years. And if you step back far enough, it's a continuous, steady upward trajectory marked by, you know, some blips here and there. So we feel it's very, very difficult to time the market. And I always try to remember, I like to read books written by famous people. And one of them was the original J.P. Morgan. So J.P. Morgan is being interviewed by some newspaper reporters, and they say, Mr. Morgan, can you tell us what's going to happen in the market over the next year? So he says, well, son, you know, prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. So I try to remember that when anybody says, well, gee, what do you think is going to happen? So, you know, nobody knows. He didn't know. I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen short term, but I do know what's going to happen long term. So I think it's critical at a time like this to maintain a long-term view and really step back so you can see the long-term trend. And as long as you're investing appropriately, meaning you're using, you know, stocks for long-term investments and stocks, maybe bonds for medium-term and cash for short-term, then you should be able to withstand any storm. So I just like to leave you with that thought. And remember what J.P. Morgan says.
Yes, none of us have a crystal ball. We don't know.
It's true. It's true. So those are pretty much the areas that we touch upon when we do the stress test. We look at the estate plan, the business succession planning, the insurance, the investments. We want to make sure that all the asset titling is correct. And as Paul pointed out, our major focus is that everything is coordinated and addresses the family and the laws as they are today. So even if they have a beautifully written will by the best law firm in New York City, but it was done 15 years ago, it might have been great 15 years ago, but it's not great today. So everything has to be updated. Everything has to be stress tested to see how does it actually work today. So we have a system where we develop a report that shows you exactly how the plan works, and it's going to show you the strengths of the plan, the weaknesses of the plan, sometimes areas for improvement, and things that we think are critical issues that have to be addressed right now. And at that point, the family has a couple of choices. It might turn out that upon review, the plan is good. Maybe they reviewed it a couple of years ago and everything's solid, and then they can have the peace of mind that an additional team has said, yes, your plan is in good shape, don't worry. Or they might find out that there are areas that need to be addressed. And then they have two different choices. They can either say, I've been working with the XYZ group for the last 27 years. I think I'll work with them and have them solve my problem. Or if they're interested in talking with me and Paul, we can sit down and let them know how we work and what we might do to fix their issues. That's really up to them. So I'll just leave you with that note. And Paul, did you want to mention something about the survey we put together?
Yeah. So we put together a questionnaire as a follow-up to today's meeting. And Angela, I believe you're going to send it out as a follow-up?
Yes. After you make your comment, I'll give some context to that as well. But for sure, I looked at it a little while ago. It's fantastic. And I think it's going to be very engaging. But for those that are not the live listeners, where I'm going to send it to them in the next hour, the vast majority are going to see this after the fact on YouTube or on Apple, Spotify, etc. How could they potentially learn more about that? How could they obtain that from you so they could potentially complete it?
So a couple of things. We put together a questionnaire that Angela's going to set. It has 20 questions. 16 questions. When Kevin and I usually speak in front of groups, we'll open with that before we do the presentation so people can understand whether they've done all the planning or there are areas that need to be addressed. And it usually focuses in very well. But if as a result of answering the questionnaire, you find that everything is in good order, I would say, go have a drink, go play golf. You really don't need to be stress tested. But if you find there are some areas, it's perfect you can contact us and we'll be happy to put together the stress test. So Angela is going to be sending it out to today's users. We have this. Kevin, can we post this on our website?
Yeah, so we'll have it on our website, that's wealthpreservationsolutions.com, or you can go to the family office portal. We're on the portal, or you can just contact Angelo and we'll send you the survey. And then I think that's pretty much it for us. Paul, do you want to close with anything else?
No, I think Angelo is going to talk about that survey, but I think, just reiterating everything we went through today is we are sure most of the listeners here have done some very sophisticated planning over a number of years. But it's critical that you take a look at it and make sure it still works the way you anticipated it to work. And always moving forward, we recommend that everybody have their advisory team work hand in hand to avoid any of the pitfalls that we discussed today.
And yes, for our live audience listening in, about 20 people, you'll receive the questionnaire that they developed directly from me or my team. And it's a chance for you to, listen to what you heard today, to kind of spend a couple of minutes just doing that. And if you don't like what you're seeing, again, if it looks like you're in good shape, enjoy, hit the golf course, whatever you enjoy, you drink. But I think many of you are going to find that, wow, don't forget we had the 2017, which was in December, so really more like 18, the changes to the tax law. And now we have COVID and market dislocations. There's just so much going on in the last couple of months to last 2 years that you gave a great example. You might have had the best firm in New York that did all your documents, and I believe you probably did. But if that was even 2.5 years ago, just so much has changed. A lot has changed and is continuing to change moving forward. Part of it will depend on politics, like you noted, who gets elected into office, what rules what benefits get extended, what gets rolled back. The exemption is going to be a big issue. And so for those, Paul, again, I know Kevin mentioned it, but for those that want to learn more or are hearing this after the fact and maybe want to see that stress test questionnaire, Kevin mentioned simply go to the website, but if you could again read that website URL.
Sure. So it's the same as our company name, wealthpreservationsolutions.com. And we'll have it up so you can just download it and answer the questions. And we'll take it from there.
That's fantastic. And everyone, it's been great to have Kevin Ellman and Paul Miller of Wealth Preservation Solutions on the show. They were a guest a while back, early during COVID, and that was a little bit more of a focused conversation at that time about significant market dislocation, gravely low interest rates, and opportunities more specific, again, to estate planning. But it was great to have a more broad discussion, especially on the business issues and the buy and sell. And I'm glad that we had a chance to cover that. There's other topics we could cover in the future because these gentlemen are a treasure trove of information, and one that kind of is applicable in the single family office as well as kind of key person. You know, what happens, especially with COVID-19, that you may have a brilliant CIO, CEO who runs the family office, and unfortunately, I hate to lead with death or significant disability that leads them to retire. That would be a different type of situation. But that could be devastating to the family's hopes and dreams relative to their family office. So there's lots of things, honestly, that need to be stress tested. And perhaps COVID-19 in some ways is just reminding everyone of that. Everyone, I'm Angelo Robles. I'm the host of Angelo Robles' Effective Family Office podcast on Apple, Stitcher, iHeart, and Spotify and other platforms, and founder and CEO at Family Office Association, a global membership organization dedicated to families of great wealth and their family offices. We do a tremendous amount of proprietary original content, host global programmings, a little bit of pause because of COVID at the moment. But we've been doing Monday through Friday daily meetings for our members. It's been very engaging. Occasionally, we'll put some on YouTube or up on a podcast, but the vast majority, even those that I record, don't make it to our more broader platforms. So to really be a member is to interact at the moment. And even if you were to hear this in 3 or 4 months, some of it may not be as timely at that time because things are changing so quickly. So think about becoming a member, being active effectively daily in all that we do and all that we've been rolling out lately, which I'm not going to have the time to go into now. I actually have done some a shorter podcast about that to our red cell strategy and certain single family office stress testing services that we offer to more so exclusively for our members. You can reach me at FamilyOfficeAssociation.com. My email is angelo@FamilyOfficeAssociation.com. And leaving maybe with one teaser, I have mentioned it briefly before. I developed, I'm going to say it's 100% done. I'm tweaking a little thing on the design. The most significant PowerPoint masterclass presentation that I've ever done on creating a family office to be resilient and anti-fragile, whether from scratch or whether adapting it. And this relates to today's times during COVID, remote and digital. It's probably my masterpiece among all I've done, including my books and other initiatives. My members will, of course, have access to that, not just access to the actual PowerPoint, because that needs interpretation. So I'm going to give effectively a 3-hour masterclass about that, maybe even 4 hours. So I'll break it down into 2. We may make that available for a fee for outside members, but really it's a dedication of resources and value to our members of the Family Office Association. To give some context, we're in mid-June. As I'm talking about it, it really will be ready in 1 more week, so well before July 4th. Simply stay tuned. On that note, I'm taking enough time. I'd like to again thank Kevin Ellman and Paul Miller of Wealth Preservation Solutions. Thanks to our live audience today, and those that hear this on one of our podcasting platforms or see it up on YouTube. We hope you enjoyed it. They did a great job. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.